On their own 17, the Packers line up for the first play of the game. As the ball is snapped, one man is preparing to revolutionize the sport. As the pass sails through the air, the Chicago Bears safety is sure it's out of reach, but he wasn't guarding any old receiver. On his very first reception, Don Hutson went 83 yards for a touchdown. He'd get used to that feeling. By the end of his career, 1 in 5 of his catches would result in a touchdown. A former player once said Don Hutson was the Jerry Rice of his era. But Hutson wasn't just great, he changed the game itself. Before him, passing was a sideshow. Receivers were an afterthought. By the time he was done, football would never be the same. I know what you're thinking, a guy from the 30s or 40s being one of the greatest ever, really? But by the end of this video, I think you'll be convinced. You can only judge an athlete based on the time they played in. Sure, the players at that time had other jobs, they smoked, they didn't have proper nutrition, but Hutson also lived in that era. He had the same conditions, but nobody was more dominant. But what actually made him so good? Firstly, Don Hutson was ahead of his time, by about 50 years. Before him, receivers, or ends as they were called, primarily blocked for the halfbacks. Hutson would be the first modern wide receiver. He developed several moves that are still used to this day. That includes button hooks, the stop and go, and the post route. When he entered the league in 1935, passing took a backseat to running. From 1935 to 1945, passes accounted for just over 33% of plays. Compare that to 1985 to 1995, it was over 52%. Yes, there were just 9 teams, and they didn't have a very sophisticated offensive scheme, but I would argue that makes Hutson even more impressive. Rather than being constrained by the limitations of the sport, he redefined it. If you set receiving records that stand for 40 plus years, despite playing in a run-first era, you can't simply be dismissed. What makes him truly remarkable is that his numbers actually hold up with players in the modern era. Take a look. This is in spite of Hutson getting half the attempts Rice did. Montana averaged just under 250 yards a game and 20 completions, and it was similar for Steve Young, whereas Hutson's quarterbacks threw an average of 10 completions and 156 yards. One might argue that because he was getting targeted more, it inflated his numbers. He made up 42% of the team's receptions, compared to 26% for Jerry Rice. But remember the era. This is Hutson compared to the other top 10 receivers from 1935 to 1945. He's light years ahead, so the fact he even comes close to Rice's numbers 40 years later is phenomenal. Before you say it, Hutson dominated before as well as during the war. Only 1/3 of his career was while the US was fighting. He was an All-Pro for 8 of his 11 seasons. He dominated regardless of who was on the field. But despite being one of the greatest receivers ever, he was doubted coming out of college, despite a great career at Alabama. At 6'1" and 180 pounds, he was the second lightest receiver in 1935, when the average was about 200 pounds. But it didn't take long to show how stupid the doubt was. With his very first reception, Hutson caught an 83-yard touchdown pass in the game's only score. What Hutson lacked in size, he made up for with speed, agility, and route running. And that's the second part of his dominance. He was extremely talented. He ran a 9.7 100-yard dash, which translated to a 10.6 100-meter time. Jesse Owens then held the world record at 10.2. So yeah, Hutson was fast. He'd use that speed to his advantage, masterfully faking when he was running without losing a step. Hutson is the only man who can feint in 3 directions at once. But nobody had seen a player like him before, so they didn't know how to defend him. Teams were forced to double, even triple team him, which was a totally new concept at the time. Nobody had warranted such attention from defenders, but even that couldn't stop him. And while teams like the Bears would design several defenses just for Hutson, George Halas admitted, "I just concede him 2 touchdowns a game, and hope we can score more." By redefining the position and being so physically dominant, Hutson would set numerous records, 19 to be precise. And that's the final part of his greatness, the resume. In Hutson's rookie year, he recorded 6 touchdowns, which led the league, the first of 9 times he would do so. Some of the most mind-blowing records he set included 99 career touchdowns. That was more than the next 3 leaders combined. It would take 44 years for this record to be broken by Steve Largent. During all those touchdown-filled seasons, he ranked first in consecutive years leading the NFL in touchdown catches, but also second. His 7,991 career receptions was first all-time, and again, more than the next 3 players combined. Imagine he played in a 16-game season. Some of these records would never be broken. Nobody could guard him. Nobody. He led the NFL in receiving in 7 of his 11 seasons. Nobody to this day has led more than 3. That included 1942, when he finished with over 1,200 yards, the first 1,000-yard season in NFL history. The Packers passed for a total of 2,367 yards, so Hutson accounted for 51% of his quarterback's yards. Talk about a one-man show. He also had more receiving yards than 4 of the other 9 teams that season. Now, as you can tell, Hutson set some pretty impressive records, but there's one that will probably stand forever. Due to lingering injuries, Hutson Hutson tried to retire 3 times, but he kept coming back. Each time he did, to no surprise, he dominated. But finally, in 1945, he called it quits. Just before he could though, he put up the greatest single quarter performance ever. Despite being double teamed throughout the game, in what the AP described as an aerial scoring orgy, Hutson finished with 4 touchdowns and kicked 5 extra points in 15 minutes. Don Hutson would have dominated on any team, but the Packers have to thank a divine force that they ended up with him. And that's because Hutson signed a contract with both the Packers and the Dodgers. This was 1 year before the first draft, so NFL President Joe Carr decided the team whose contract with the earliest postmark would get Hutson. The Packers' contract was postmarked 17 minutes earlier. The 3-time NFL champ, 2-time MVP, would be a charter member of the Hall of Fame in 1963, leaving behind one of the greatest careers in NFL history to this day.